Hello, my friends. Rob Roselli coming to you once again on Rob Roselli 1, my Facebook page. Today being November 1st, 2016. And on the last show, we started on my website on a link called the Occult Conspiracy. And again, my website, boxofsunglasses.com. That's one word, boxofsunglasses.com. Email info @boxofsunglasses.com. Twitter @Rob Roselli. Of course, the Facebook Rob Roselli 1, that's a numerical 1. And again, on my site, you'll find my 3 books available on the homepage. Pleased to meet you. Okay, which is kind of an overview, a fictional conversation that actually discusses real events going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. A Satan character, which is representative of himself, of course, the Lucifer character of the Rolling Stones song Sympathy for the Devil, along with an O'Brien character from Orwell's 1984, and they discuss events, world events, in a very in a broad brush and an overview, a Cliff Notes almost kind of version, to help tie things together on this site and what we discuss on these shows. And you really have to read it to understand exactly what I'm getting at, and it helps to elucidate many of the points and items and subjects that we discuss on this show. That's available, and then also the Un-American Genocidal Complex. Okay, and many of these items, we're going to discuss, and we'll discuss again in the next couple of conversations on the Occult Conspiracy. Of course, the Georgia Guidestones, which I call the Anti-10 Commandments. The Skull and Bones, the American Illuminati, the Brotherhood of Death, the Eastern Establishment, whatever you want to call it, from this central point, at least in the American side of things, springs the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergs, the Trilaterals, the Rockefellers, J.P. Morgans, the Federal Reserve, the tax-exempt foundations, funding all the so-called liberals and progressives and Ivy League useful idiots at all the Ivy League schools, Cal, Berkeley, these kinds of places, all emanates from Skull and Bones. Okay, 322, and of course, the nexus of the world government conspiracy, the one world government or their attempt at it, the United Nations, right there in my candidate for Mystery Babylon of Revelation 17, that being the United Nations. Okay. So those 3 items, again, we'll get into these tonight, but just to give an overview, this book is a slice, okay, is a snapshot of the quote conspiracy. It focuses on Adolf Hitler and his rise to power, aided by the United States. Many of the industries in the United States, Harriman Railroad interests, of which the grandfather of the so-called conservative, the Fox News Rhino conservative, George Bush and George Bush Sr. and Jeb Bush, and anyway, the grandfather was tied in with Harriman Railroad interests, which were tied in with the Nazi war machine, along with Rockefeller, Standard Oil, General Motors, Ford, IBM, DuPont, you name it. Hitler's industrial background was a who's who of American industrial powers at the time, along with the American eugenics movement, okay, the Darwinist survival of the fittest crowd, who put a black man in the Bronx Zoo as proof of evolution, okay, and also deemed themselves knighted themselves essentially, or deified themselves to be the God. Since God doesn't exist, they kind of stepped into the void that they created for themselves and decided who lives and who dies and who gets sent to sanitariums and who gets institutionalized, who is a moron, a misfit, a human weed, an imbecile, who was not evolved. Okay, and many times this turned out to be lower rung white people and black people, Negroes, to quote Margaret Sanger, who basically said, why are we institutionalizing and spending money on these imbeciles, morons, misfits, human weeds, and Negroes when we can just kill them before they're born? Hence was born something called the American Birth Control League, which was one of Adolf Hitler's favorites, okay, and in turn, Hitler was one of Margaret Sanger's favorite, along with the Ku Klux Klan, and of course, today we know her fine institution of infant genocide. We call it Planned Parenthood. Okay, so that is just a slice of the quote conspiracy that's presented there for your reading pleasure. Um, and the point being is that the quote conspiracy is much more evil, much more pervasive, much more in our face than these so-called prophets of God. That's prophets with an F. These imbeciles who call themselves pastors and Christians and get on things like Daystar and the Trinity Broadcasting Network, and not 100%, but close to it. Most of these people are buffoonish clowns who have no idea what they're talking about. Okay, selling their wares, peddling their books and their nonsense and their Israel first crap. Uh, when it's readily apparent by reading things like the Un-American Genocidal Complex that God's disdain and disfavor lies right here with these very United States. Okay, and I'll be careful to say, when I say these United States, I'm talking about the Federal Reserve Corporation, formerly known as the United States. Okay, because what exists right now, led by this scam, this image in the White House, this mist, this phantom, this ghost, Pharaoh Barry, who's fallen out of the news as of late, by the way. Parentheses, but anyway, this nation led by this Nobel Peace Prize winning, abortion crazed, every religion, multi-name scam, warmongering psychopath and his Egyptian high priest handlers, Rockefeller, Rothschild, and the rest of them, with its mercenary army. It's not my country. I don't know whose country it is. I guess it belongs to the bankers and all this sort of thing. Which, by the way, if you think Trump is going to stop this or end this, I hate to disappoint a lot of people, but it ain't going to happen. Okay, as we're going to get into here in a little bit, the occult conspiracy stretches back to the Garden of Eden. Okay, and the people, the high priests of finance and control, who placed the image of the beast. Notice I'm not saying Antichrist. Who placed the image of the beast, Pharaoh Barry, their front man, into the White House, aren't going to give in so easily, okay? And they certainly are not going to care about or capitulate to 200 or million or whatever the support is for Trump right now. Really just pissed off Americans. It's not going to stop these people, okay? As explained in the Un-American Genocidal Complex, these people are certifiably insane psychopaths, genocidal maniacs, and just literal devil worshippers. Okay, there is no bottom. There is no bottom to these people. These are dark people. Okay, this is why I call Pharaoh Barry, because he's the face of this. Okay, and as we saw back in the book of Exodus with the 10 plagues, which, by the way, speak to many of the gods and goddesses of Egypt, which we cover, which are underneath the surface of what we discuss on the show, in parentheses. But anyway, this is why Pharaoh of Egypt, he never got the hint. Okay, you had 10 plagues, and then after the 10 plagues, which culminated in the death of his firstborn, which represents the firstborn of the male and the female. You know, the columns, the rose and the cross of Freemasonry. Remember, we discussed that at length. But anyway, the Rosicrucians, the 18th degree, the 606 and 6 degree, or 6 plus 6 plus 6 degree of Freemasonry, the Rosy Cross degree. All right, so those who say that Freemasons aren't devil worshippers, I mean, I don't know how more obvious I could make it. But anyway, they're not going anywhere. Okay, and they don't take hints, just like Pharaoh in ancient Egypt, the 10 plagues, the death of the firstborn, and even after he let the Israelites go, he decided to change his mind. Remember, after the hail, the darkness, okay, the locusts, the boils, the flies, the frogs, the Nile turning to blood, all that, this guy still did not get the hint and sent his Egyptian army after the Israelites into the desert. And of course, we know the crossing of the Red Sea, which I believe properly interpreted is the Sea of Reeds, which again is a knock on the god of the Nile and the god of agriculture, which is Apollo, the Greek Apollo, the Egyptian Osiris, or the constellation Orion, the mighty hunter, which just so happens to align with the Apollyon of Revelation chapter 9. But anyway, just didn't get the hint. Okay, so the point being that he was just dark. Okay, the lights were out. There was nothing that was going to redeem him. There was nothing that he was going to recoup him. Okay, just like Pharaoh Barry and his handlers. Okay, these people will stop at nothing. And I've been asked, how there's no bottom. Okay, just like Sheol itself, there is no bottom to these people. Okay, if they did not hesitate to start World War I, which they did, get the United States involved in World War I for no good reason other than wealth, and to set up their first attempt at world government called the League of Nations. And when that didn't work out, they set up World War II. Okay, and we're going to get into this tonight, which is highlighted in this book. So why would they stop if they were willing to spawn Adolf Hitler and the communists? As a matter of fact, communism, I don't even get into that in the Un-American Genocidal Complex. In other words, it's just a slice of the Occult Conspiracy. But if you think between Mao, Stalin, and Hitler, I mean, we're talking, we're getting into fractions of a billion people that were murdered as a result of the efforts of the Rockefeller Rothschild Federal Reserve Gang. So what makes anybody think that they will simply stop at 500 million people? What makes people think they won't just kill the entire population of the world and or enslave it to achieve what they believe it is their utopia? Okay, and again, this is exemplified in the anti-Ten Commandments of the Georgia Guidestones. Anti-Ten Commandment number 1 is maintain humanity under 500 million people. Okay, for those of you that are counting, there's 7 billion people on the earth, which results in roughly a 92%, whatever, reduction in the human population. Now, how are you going to go about doing that? Well, you're going to put the AIDS vaccine, the AIDS virus, into a smallpox vaccine and give it to millions of people in Africa and homosexuals here in the United States is one way. You're gonna put all kinds of chemicals into the water supply. You're gonna chemotherapy with cancer. You're gonna keep giving people these vaccines, which are nothing more than death concoctions of death. Okay, which I don't necessarily want to get into right now, and you're gonna start wars and abortion. Okay, I can't forget that. As we just discussed, the Margaret Sanger's Negro Project is responsible for 50 million plus deaths, and even Pharaoh Barry in the White House. The only thing we know about this guy, we don't know his real name. I just call him Pharaoh Barry. I mean, the guy has more names than a Manhattan phone book. The fake Social Security number, the forged birth certificate, the at least 3 places of birth. That's not conspiracy theory, okay? He claims that he was born in Kenya, and there's 2 hospitals in Hawaii that claim him as birth, and that's just fact. That's just objective fact. So how can you have 3 places of birth? But anyway, the point being, the guy's he's a mist, he's a mystery, he's a phantom. Okay, but one thing we know about him is that he voted multiple times against something called the Born Alive Infant Abortion Protection Act. So that's the guy's voting record coming into office. Now, as we're finding out, and as we're, as I discussed, and I got this in the mail from the Life Legal Defense Fund, and this talked about one particular case where a Planned Parenthood member of Planned Parenthood, and one of these companies that buys these baby body parts, a 20-week-old baby boy laid on a stainless steel tray, his legs twitched. And basically what happened was the lab tech went to work. We made a small incision under the chin. They insert the scissors and begin cutting through the face. That opens the skull from the front. If done correctly, usually you can see the whole brain come out. So that is an example of the abortion industry, okay, and exposing the people that expose that barbarism, okay, that sacrifice to Moloch or Baal, which was present in the Old Testament, which, don't kid yourselves, is present today, okay. These environmental radicals, these population control zealots, like this Harvard scumbag, the scientific advisor to Farrell Barry, John Holdren, talks about these, and Pete Singer over there, and another Ivy League hack school, Princeton University, another genocidal maniac, okay, who believes that humans don't even develop till 3 years old, so you can just kill a 1 or 2 or 3-year-old in his mind. Okay, this is the mentality of these people. Okay, so it's no shock. It shouldn't be too shocking when we talk about ripping a baby's face off and selling its brain for $160. Okay, now this is a nation. This is supposed to be, or this was a Christian nation. Okay, and we have fallen to a point where we rip a live baby's face off and sell its brains for $160. Okay, so if there is a better candidate, okay, for Mystery Babylon, if there's a better candidate for a nation that God hates, okay, and I emphasize the word hate, then I'm all ears, okay. This is why I can't stand these imbeciles, these morons, and these misfits on these so-called Christian evangelical leaders, okay, the Joel Osteens and the Rick Warrens, okay, and I'll say those two names in particular that I absolutely disdain, okay, with their stupid smiley faces and their idiocy, okay, and their nonsense, okay, and people look at these clowns like they're some kind of Christian leaders, okay, and meanwhile stuff like this is going on, all right. So I can think of no other nation that God hates than this Federal Reserve Corporation known as the United States. And before we get into the occult conspiracy, because this all ties together, let's take a look at the book of Proverbs. Let me call it up here. We'll read right out of the book of Proverbs. We'll go through the checklist, okay, of 7 things that the Lord hates, okay. Now, it's obvious he's talking about people here, okay, and we'll read the passage and then we'll make that comment, okay. Let's see here. We're in Proverbs chapter 6. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. Here we go. Starting with, we'll go back to verse 15, because a couple weeks back, we talked about the sudden calamity that would come upon Mystery Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18. Okay, so here's Proverbs 6:15. Therefore shall his calamity come suddenly. Suddenly shall he be broken without, without remedy. Okay, this is a description of what's going to happen to you, to the United States. But anyway, these 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. Okay, so we're on Revelation 6:15. Okay, a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, okay, i.e., ripping a baby's face off and selling its brains for $160, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren. Excuse me for 1 second. So anyway, the number 7. I mean, is there any a better description of Farrell Barry? Okay, the number 7 in 7 things that the Lord hates. He that soweth discord among brethren. Okay, that's the modus operandi of our criminal overlords, okay, who do nothing but perpetuate hatred and animosity and acrimony, okay. This is how these people stay in power. It's a perpetual state of hatred, okay. It's white against black, it's white against immigrant, it's blacks against Mexicans, it's old against young with the Social Security scam, okay. It's people with medical care and people without medical care. Meanwhile, the people doling out these so-called limited resources is the very Federal Reserve System that rule all these loser politicians, okay. So it's a scam from the top to the bottom, okay. But people are kept in a state of perpetual animosity and acrimony and hatred. when the real target should be the Federal Reserve Corporation. Okay, but let's just talk about these things real quick. Okay, these 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination to him. Okay, and this ties into the abomination of desolation talked about in Daniel chapter 9, by the way. Okay, it's not going to be some goofy comic book antichrist showing up at some rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, start handing out, start branding people with 666s in their foreheads and sending them on their way. Meanwhile, the Christians that sit in John Hagee's mega church, they're going to get raptured out before all this, and then the Jews are going to get rescued, and you're going to have a 1,000-year reign of Christ. It's all a bunch of nonsense, okay? It's all just nonsense, okay? It says it right here. I just read to you what the 7 abominations, or 7 things that are an abomination to the Lord. Okay, in the United States, scores a perfect 7 out of 7. And of course, these all describe Pharaoh Barry, who is the image of these very United States, the image of the beast. Okay, but if you think about it, okay, hands that shed innocent blood. Now that's not literal hands. Okay. The hands have to be directed by a brain, okay? So what God hates is he hates the person that cuts a baby's face off and sells its brain for $160, okay? So out there, these powder puff losers, okay, the Rick Warrens of the world, God doesn't hate, and Chrislam and whatever nonsense that guy's preaching. It's like, no, God hates you, okay? I don't know how else to say it. Okay, you're not redeemable, and that's it. Okay, for the most part, and we must pray that people. I've been walking a fine line here, but just like in the case of Pharaoh, or in the case of many of these cold-blooded killers, especially our criminal overlords who have definitely given their minds and their lives over to Satan, they're not redeemable. Okay, these are the people that have accepted the mark of the beast and the name of the beast. By the way, in Revelation 13. Okay, it's not a literal mark. It might manifest itself in the in the last in the waning days of humanity and Earth and life itself. Okay, you might have a situation where people are getting microchipped, and it's kind of starting to filter into society and all this kind of thing. But things are going to happen so fast and so rapidly. We have a lot more to worry about than getting microchipped. Okay. Prior to that, based on the proper breakdown of Revelation 17 and 18. I don't necessarily want to go back into that right now. We spent several shows talking about that. But the point is, there's a lot more to this quote conspiracy. And again, it's a lot more pervasive and in our faces than people are willing to admit or even know to admit. Okay, now we already talked about the un-American genocidal complex. I'll just, another example. Okay. Now, remember, we mentioned Apollo or Cyrus or Nimrod. Okay, Nimrod, the leader of the first Babel. Okay, back there in Genesis chapter 11. But, here's his all-seeing eye right above the capless pyramid on the Federal Reserve note. Okay, there's the ancient Egyptian pyramid of Giza. Okay, and it's right in our face. It's not hidden. And this is St. John's Divine Cathedral in Mystery Babylon, USA. Okay, or New York City, financed by a lot of the same people that brought us this thing. So when I say our overlords, our criminal overlords, the high priest behind Pharaoh Barry, a bunch of devil-worshipping genocidal maniacs, I'm not saying that to be funny. I'm saying that because I really mean that it's true. These people are devil-worshipping, or specifically, Apollo or Apollyon of Revelation 9, really the same thing, but this is what these people are. It's just that simple. Okay, and it's going to become readily apparent in the days and weeks ahead. Okay, and again, and I pray that I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope a year from now I'm not here and my credibility is shot and everything I say is wrong, and President Trump has got the country on the right track, and we're back to the days of old as the greatest nation in the history of the earth. But I gotta be honest, I don't see it. Okay, I don't think it's gonna happen. I think these people are gonna get absolutely desperate. The Russians and the Chinese are already looking at these people as a bunch of warmongering psychopaths. Now think about that for a second, okay? Think about your Vladimir Putin, okay, sitting over there in Moscow, okay, and you're watching this nonsense, this clown show unfold, okay? You have a woman, a would-be president, okay, and have an aide, okay, who's a high-ranking member, ties to the highest levels of the Saudi government, okay, and the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Council on American-Islamic Relations, okay, and ties to all these so-called terrorist groups, these moderate terrorists that were supposed to be fighting over in Egypt, or excuse me, in Syria and Iraq and this sort of thing. Then you have Queen Jezebel, okay, who has ties to these groups as well, and the whole Benghazi thing and sending money and arms through Benghazi to these so-called moderate rebels in Syria, and then these moderate rebels would turn tail and become these so-called the ISIS, which is just how CIA dog, transplanted from Afghanistan. So the point is the whole thing's a mess. Okay, you got that whole situation, and then you have this freak Carlos Danger, okay, a United States congressman, Anthony Weiner, the husband of this Council on American Islamic Relations, this high-level mole of Saudi Arabian Wahhabism, okay, sitting on the right hand of the Secretary of State, and on her computer, on the same hard drive, you have hundreds of thousands of top secret and classified emails, and maybe not all, but who knows what the number is, on the same hard drive as you have of this weirdo, Anthony Weiner, or Carlos Danger, whatever he called himself, sexting or texting or whatever it is, a 15-year-old girl. So let's think about that. On the same hard drive, on the same computer, you have this mixture of top secret classified emails and emails to a 15-year-old girl from a pedophile, okay? And you're Vladimir Putin, and you're sitting there and you're watching, you're saying, this woman's going to become president of what's supposed to be the most powerful nation in the world. I'm supposed to deal with these people, okay, this shill, this Queen Jezebel, this bloodthirsty maniac, okay, who laughed when the body of Muammar Gaddafi was dragged through the streets of Libya. Okay, Libya was the up-and-coming economic power in Africa, a stable nation. Okay, and I'm not saying it was perfect or Muammar Gaddafi was perfect, but anybody can recover. Anybody like the Apostle Paul or King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, or the Assyrians in the book of Jonah, okay, can do a complete turnaround and become saved. Okay, and I'm not saying I don't know Gaddafi well enough, but he was certainly on the road to recovering, in terms. And here comes Queen Jezebel, okay, this evil bitch, okay, who basically had the man murdered, okay, and laughed about it on national TV. We saw he died, laughed about it, and created this power vacuum. And now you have this disaster called Libya, okay, and they're trying to spread this disaster to Syria. They've already spread it to Iraq and Afghanistan. They're trying the same thing in Ukraine. Now you're Putin, and you're sitting there and you're looking at all this, and then it culminates in a situation where you have a person that would be president, whose top aide has a computer that has top secret emails and child porn on it. All right, so Putin's, in his mind, his calculations, I'm not dealing with rational people here. Okay, so what do you think is going to happen? Now, I'm just some imbecile sitting here in my home office, and just based on the research that I do, and I don't go on any top secret websites. I go on the same 3 or 4 websites a day. Half the time I don't even read the stories. I just read the headlines just to get the flavor for what's going on. But you're Putin, and you have access to some of the best intelligence in the world. What are you thinking? What do you expect this guy to think? Okay. This shill. Okay, who's a good possibility she'll still win, by the way, with the vote rigging, the dead people voting. Okay, illegal aliens or whoever getting bussed around the different voting sites because you can't check IDs. Okay, the George Soros, one of the four horsemen of the American apocalypse, along with David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Henry Kissinger. And I'm sure there's more, but those four are enough. But anyway, you got George Soros, with his rigged voting machine. So there's a good possibility that Queen Jezebel is going to win this thing anyway. Okay. But even if she doesn't, if she does or doesn't, it doesn't matter. Okay. And I don't want to get into the subject right now. Maybe we have gotten into it in the past, but Pharaoh Barry's their man. Okay. He's the image. He's the image of the beast. He ain't going anywhere. Okay. They will initiate a world war. They will finalize the economic collapse. They will induce the calamity. Okay, the order. They will induce their chaos, from which they will get their order. Remember, we were talking about before their self-aggrandizing. Okay, their self-imposed utopia that they were promised from Lucifer, or Satan, the father of lies. Way back when, and I don't want to go off on that tangent right now, but I cover that a direct conversation in a meeting with the Rothschild banking families and the mysterious character we now know as Robert Christian. Okay, and it's documented in section 3 of this book. Okay, they live. Okay, Great Society of the Undead. I don't remember exactly what section, but it's in chapter 3. And this book is available on the as a PDF on my site. I don't remember exactly what section it's in. Okay, but it's in section 3. I'm pretty sure that it goes into this meeting between Robert Christian, this mysterious character known as Robert Christian, and I have a whole page, okay, dedicated to Robert Christian. Again, we went through this on past shows, but it's page 10 on my site. Okay, and just to give the overview, okay, Robert Christian is a legendary / historical figure. Nobody knows who the hell this guy is or was. Okay, except that he pops in and out of history and mythology and legend, like a certain serpent described in the Bible. Okay, there's no other words I can describe, and I have multiple sources. Okay, different literary people, historians, authors, etc., who have this guy living, Robert Christian, living over several centuries. Okay, and some that say he never lived at all; he just lived in legend. And there's other people that say no, he was alive. He was running around the capitals in Europe, and he was involved with the French Revolution. And others that say, well, he was alive, back during the time of the Enlightenment, say in the Renaissance, say around the 13 to the 1500s. Okay. Maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit in the Occult Conspiracy. We'll circle back around to this in a little bit, but the point is that that's the same Robert Christian, the Rosicrucians, that built these things on March 22nd, 1980. Okay, and we're going to get into that here in a minute. Just keep that thought in mind. Okay, so again, the magnitude of the occult conspiracy and the pervasiveness of it, Trump ain't going to stop this. All right, God in the flesh, Jesus Christ himself, couldn't stop these people. Okay, remember that. Okay, as a human, every perfect human that ever lived, okay, he chased them out of the temple with whips 2 times. Okay, called them a den of vipers and thieves and asked them how they can escape the condemnation of hell, which is kind of funny considering many of these goofball, so-called Christian evangelicals, call Israel God's chosen people, and, Jesus himself is basically saying they're condemned to hell. But anyway, he couldn't defeat these guys. Okay, in human form. He couldn't convince them. There was no convincing these people. Okay, and of course he had his encounter with Satan in the desert in Matthew 4 and Luke chapter 4. Okay, and Satan, shows him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. Which, by the way, there's an accountant, an author, a guy in Oxford, I think he's from Oxford, Mark Booth, called The Secret History of the World, and I cover this on the Robert Christian link too. Okay, there's a passage in that book that describes this very Saint Germain or Robert Christian or Christian Rose Cross or whatever, his German name, Christian Rosenkreuz, that reads just like Matthew 4 and Luke chapter 4, by the way. Okay, and I don't necessarily want to get into that right now, but it's around the time of the French Revolution, and this Italian troublemaker of the time, around the time of the French Revolution, known as Cagliostro. Okay, basically, Saul Alinsky, Pharaoh Barry kind of type, just a rabble rouser, troublemaker, preaching perpetual animosity and acrimony and hatred, just like Pharaoh Barry. But anyway, this guy has an encounter with this mysterious Saint Germain character, which is one and the same with Robert Christian. That's very interesting. And again, that's all covered on in the Robert Christian link. And in the Robert Christian link, there's 12 different, chapters, I'll call them. There's an introduction that goes through, the mysterious nature of this guy. Okay, the no background, came out of nowhere, no background, all kinds of charisma, fooled a lot of people. But he was a mist. He's an image. Okay, he jumps in and out of history with no background. Okay, yet at the same time, he was heavily involved in European politics. Yet at the same time, according to many, he never existed. But anyway, so we're going to get back to the occult conspiracy here. And just to repeat, okay, the three principles. And remember, the Bible is it, okay, it's the core of the quote conspiracy. It really does go back to the book of Genesis, okay? And it's an all or nothing proposition, okay? There's no negotiating, there's no compromising, there's no, what is the term, theological evolution or whatever, these imbeciles, they want to compromise with these idiots, these evolutionists, okay, with their nonsense called evolution, okay, which contradicts every known law of science, okay? So that's just not, it's either a take it or leave it proposition. Okay, number two is that, the Jews, as I've alluded to before, they're not God's chosen people. Okay, they were chosen, they fumbled. Okay, just about the entire Old Testament. I don't know how much more clear God can make it, through most of the Old Testament, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the so-called minor prophets, the destruction, the Babylonian, the Assyrians taking over the northern kingdom of Israel, the Babylonians taking, destroying the southern kingdom of Israel. Okay, and then finally, Jesus himself comes back and, John the Baptist, calls them a den of vipers and thieves, and Jesus himself calls them a den of vipers and thieves, and, says, how can you escape being condemned to hell? The Apostle Paul, who had to be extricated from the Jewish religion before he could write most of the New Testament, comes to the same conclusion. So at some point you have to sit there and say, wait a second, what are these goofballs trying to say? These, these imbeciles, wearing their Jewish stars, trying to fool these poor Christians in America to giving money to Israel as they wear their Jewish star, okay, which is right here on the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is really a symbol of Hermes, thrice great in the Emerald Tablet, and that's now getting into the Da Vinci Code territory. As above, so below. Man can become God. Genesis chapter 3. Yea, as God said, you shall not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which again we'll get to here in a minute. But as above, so below. That's represented here. Okay, that's the real. This is the Star of Solomon. Okay, it's not the Star of David. Okay. But anyway, there's your Obama rising sun. Okay, the rising sun in the east, Columbia. Okay, Columbia is another name for the female goddess, the female whore goddess, the whore of Babylon, Isis. Okay, the Greek Diana, or the Roman Diana, excuse me, and the Greek Artemis. Or another name for the female goddess is Columbia, by the way. Okay, so remember the rose plus the cross, the male plus the female. Another name for rose is Occident or West or setting sun. Okay, so remember Pharaoh Barry went to Occidental supposedly, even though there's no record of him, no records whatsoever available on anything. And of course, he also went to Columbia University. Columbia, the East, the female, the male plus the female, Osiris plus Isis, okay, the sun plus the moon, rising sun, Obama, okay, is it starting to make sense now? Okay, Pharaoh, now you know why I call him Pharaoh Barry. Just as the Pharaoh was supposedly the firstborn of Isis and Osiris, each Pharaoh was a reincarnation through this union of the male and the female, which stretches all the way back to Genesis 3 and 4, by the way. It's one and the same with Greek and Roman and Egyptian, quote, mythology. But anyway, so, you know, not to go off too much on that tangent right now, so you can see how deep the quote conspiracy really goes and how idiotic a lot of these people really are. They're misleading a lot of good and decent people. You know, give money to Israel. And I'm not anti-Israel, by the way. I mean, they're just as privy to, you know, salvation as any of us so-called, you know, Gentiles out here. Okay, but I'm just talking from a strictly biblical standpoint. And there is evidence that the regathering of Israel was a divine event. Okay, as described in Ezekiel chapter 36. But that's it. Okay, they're not God's chosen people. Okay, Revelation doesn't center around Israel, at least as far as the United States is concerned. I believe it does, but the United States is long gone by the time that happens. Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to say is stop worrying about Israel. Start worrying about what's going to happen in this nation. Okay, the nation that God hates, as we just read in Proverbs 6 and 7. And then, of course, number 3, you know, it segues right into my third major point, is that there's no doubt that these United States is the mystery Babylon of Revelation. There's no doubt. Okay, there's no arguing. Okay, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope somebody can out-argue me on that point and it's somewhere else. But, you know, we're a nation. It really wasn't the organic population. I mean, the majority of this population were devout Christians at the founding of this nation. Okay, now I know some were Freemasons. I know there's the people out there with the Washington, D.C. occultism. You know, George Washington was a Mason. I know there's that whole crowd. But a lot of that stuff came, you know, decades after a lot of these guys were dead. Like George Washington, okay? They're trying to pin all this occultism and these paintings in the Capitol, which I don't disagree with. They're trying to pin it on George Washington, but George Washington was dead for decades before all this stuff came out, right? And this nation, which was a Christian nation, no doubt, I mean, based on the writings of the founders and the lesser-known founders, I know there's the jury's still out on Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton and a few of the more well-known founders, but again, the organic Mr. and Mrs. America and your lesser-known founders, your Samuel Adams, your Patrick Henrys, your Peter Muhlenbergs, okay, your Roger Shermans, and these sorts of people, okay, were devout Christians, okay, as was the overriding population of the country. So, you know, we've gone from that mentality. And in fact, another thing, you know, the Constitution was written from a biblical standpoint. I mean, the separation of powers. And the Ten Amendments was written from the biblical standpoint that mankind is inherently evil and the separation of powers. So just to talk about that for 30 seconds, okay, so it kind of cracks me up when people say, well, you know, the United States is part of the conspiracy and the founders and the, you know, the Freemasons. And I'm not saying that, you know, this architecture in Washington, D.C. and the obelisk, you know, that's the Washington Monument, which is really the phallus of Osiris, you know, which goes along with the Columbia on top of the Capitol Dome, and what we just talked about, the rose plus the cross, the male plus the female. But anyway, again, all that stuff came out decades after a lot of these guys had passed on. Okay, but the mentality, okay, the theme behind the separation of powers of the Constitution was the biblical concept of the inherent evil nature that's in all of us. Okay, Romans chapter 6 and Romans chapter 3, you know, all of sin and comes short of the glory of God, and you know, there's no righteous, no one, okay? But anyway, that's from that standpoint that we have our Constitution. So for these people, and many of these, quote, my fellow conspiracy theorists, a lot of these guys, you know, I like their stuff and they have a lot of good information, but they're just wrong. I mean, how could you miss that the real occult conspiracy or Rockefeller, Rothschild, un-American genocidal complex have spent 100 years trying to denigrate and dissolve the Constitution, okay? Because they know once, if that document exists and the nation actually follows it, and it spreads out power and it limits power and it really gives power to the people in a true fashion, not in some Ivy League, Saul Alinsky, stupid utopia, communist utopia, jack-off kind of way, idiot liberals, but in a true sense, a constitutional republic, okay, they wouldn't have spent so much time and invested really, literally a century since the founding of the Federal Reserve and the tax-exempt foundations, your Rockefeller Brothers Fund, your Carnegie Endowment, okay, from which we got the Weather Underground, by the way, another group of useful jackasses, William Harris, idiot, radical political prisoner, anarchist getting his money from the Carnegie Foundation, imbecile. But anyway, they want to spend so much time and money denigrating and destroying the Constitution as they have, dumbing down the population through the education system, and still after 100 years of pure just bashing, it still stands. Okay, so to sit here and say that the founders and the foundation of this nation, and that we're occultists involved, I admit, okay, there was a spiritual struggle in this nation, which, New Atlantis and Francis Bacon and that whole crowd, but what resulted from the Revolutionary War, if it was followed, would be the number one, and it still is the number one resistance to the whole New World Order crowd. So how can you sit here and say that the foundation of this nation and focus on the occultism of few of the founders, which again is up for grabs? I mean, that's a debate, who knows, but I don't get that at all. But anyway, that just kind of ties into the whole thing, just getting back to, just to make the point, the nation did start out as a fundamentalist Christian nation, and we've fallen to the point where we rip a baby's face off and sell its brain for $160. So you tell me, I mean, is Donald Trump, I mean, if you're a real Christian, and I hope Donald Trump is saved, and I hope, he seems like he wants to do the right thing, but is he really going to stick to Christian principles and get this nation back to where it started? And I'm going to say no. Okay, I don't believe he's that strong a Christian, and again, hopefully that changes. Okay, number one. And number two, the New World Order crowd, the Occult Conspiracy crowd, they've been living for this moment, really going back to the Garden of Eden. Okay, so let's get into the Occult Conspiracy now. Just to review real quickly, we went back and we talked about, the numbers. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is really a study and a play on numbers. Okay, and we discussed, numbers are used for all kinds of technology, and numbers are at the base of our reality itself. Okay, numbers are indicative of order and a designer. Okay, so if you're an a-hole evolutionist, of course you believe that, well, I don't know what you believe. I don't know. You either believe that the universe existed in infinity because you need infinite time to justify your idiotic theories. But the problem when you go that route, okay, is that you're in direct contradiction with the second law of thermodynamics. So if the universe existed for infinity, the second law of thermodynamics says, is the law of entropy, or, things decay. The universe would have decayed into nothingness already. Okay. So, they're kind of stuck there. They can't say the universe existed for infinity, because if that's the fact, then the second law, scientific law of thermodynamics isn't true. Okay. So then they jump over, everybody gets off that bandwagon, so we can't stay here being a-hole evolutionists that they are, and their science is really a hatred of God, which means it's 100% theology and not science at all. So they jump off the universe existed for infinity bandwagon, and jump onto the Big Bang bandwagon. The problem with that is you can't get order and design out of complete chaos. It's just not mathematically or scientifically possible. But again, if you make the assumption that God doesn't exist and there must be some other explanation for creation, laws of science be damned, and we'll come up with a Big Bang, which again means they've taken their they've taken an assumption, a non-scientific religious assumption, and used the facade of science to justify that assumption, which again means evolution is 100% about religion and not science. But anyway, that aside, the real occultists, okay, know better. Okay, your Rockefeller, Rothschild, Helena Blavatsky, the guys that wrote this book, The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, okay, Hermes, okay, which is another name for our friend Robert Christian, who we'll get to in a minute, the Greek god of wisdom, Hermes, the god of travel, wisdom, mathematics, Hiram Abiff, okay, of Freemasonry, okay, the Greek god Hermes, which equates to the Egyptian god Thoth or the Roman god Mercury, okay, gave this, this tree of knowledge of good and evil, okay, he was helping the ancient Egyptian Kabbalists, and this is where mythology and history kind of merge, okay, this is why you really get a grip on what's going on. Again, you got to stick to the Bible, okay, if you try to read human history, it just doesn't always work out too good. But anyway, we discussed the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the 22 branches, okay, the three columns of Freemasonry. All right, we did just real briefly. Okay, here it is in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Okay, there's your tree of life, the serpent on the tree of life. Okay, can it get more obvious? It's based on numbers, 3 columns, 22 branches, 322, March 22nd, yada yada yada. Rose plus the cross, the male plus the female. Okay, so these people know exactly what the hell they're doing. Okay, they know evolution's a bunch of crap. Okay, these idiot evolutionists. Okay, so they're, again, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now remember, the New Testament. Remember, and I say this, I'll keep pounding on this. Jesus, he encounters the Pharisees in Matthew 16, and he says, basically calls them a bunch of astrologers, and this sort of thing, and we discussed that last week of what astrology really is. And then, the apostles, later on, the apostles say, Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, and the apostles are talking about bread and actual bread, and Jesus says, no, you dopes, I'm talking about the doctrine of the Pharisees. So the doctrine of the Pharisees was a study or something, okay, extra biblical, called a Kabbalah, okay, which is the backbone of Freemasonry, okay, or what was, the precursor to Freemasonry, which was the so-called ancient mystery religions. Okay, so in other words, the Jews were taking the knowledge of God, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil, going back to the Garden of Eden, as God's chosen people, and they were taking it and they were sharing it with the devil-worshipping neighbors like the Philistines and the Canaanites and these sorts of things. The Canaanites and their god Baal, and the Philistine god Dagon, which are just mini versions of Isis and Osiris, or the sun god Apollo, or the more major populations and civilizations of the ancient world. Many versions of this guy right here, the all-seeing eye of Apollo. Okay, so now you're starting to get the picture of why God called the Jews basically spiritual religious whores. Okay, because they were whoring themselves with the religions of their neighbors. Okay, and if you go to the symbolism, again, of the obelisk in Washington, D.C., facing the womb of Columbia, or the Capitol Dome, the rose plus the cross, the male plus the female, the obelisk, the Egyptian obelisk in St. Peter's Square, and again, the obelisk is a symbolic of the phallus of the dead sun god Osiris. And how did Isis, the female goddess Isis, or Eve, okay, how did she repopulate the earth or populate the earth? She did it by squatting on the phallus of Osiris and spawning a bunch of children, okay? And that is the real meaning, okay? That's again, we keep coming back to the same point, okay? We keep going back to the Garden of Eden, I guess is what I'm getting at here, okay? So in the Old Testament and in the commandments, okay, God shall take revenge on a 3rd and 4th generation of those of them that hate me, okay? And Jesus says, you are of your father the devil, okay, in John chapter 8, and his will you will be. This is what he's talking about, okay? These people, they are the descendants of the Jews that worship the golden calf in the desert. The golden calf, again, is another offshoot, another version of this guy. Okay, the Serapis or Apis, okay, the bull was associated with another association with Osiris, okay, the male god of ancient Egypt, okay. So now all the stuff is starting to make sense. You're starting to see how this stuff ties together. You're starting to see, here it is. Okay, again, I can't say this enough. Here it is. All right. So again, is that the mark of the beast? I think so. Okay, is it some stupid barcode? Is it some, maybe, maybe it's going to happen. Has it happened yet? No. Okay, but if you're at the Bohemian Grove, say, out there in California, you're in these devil worshippers that run this nation and the world, this David Rockefeller crowd of devil worshippers at Bohemian Grove, worshiping a 40-foot owl called Moloch, okay, which is right out of the Old Testament. Moloch equates to Baal. Okay, read or Meridash, I think it's called, in Zephaniah chapter 1. Read the so-called minor prophet Zephaniah chapter 1 and see what God thinks of Baal and Moloch. I mean, have you accepted the mark of the beast in your forehead as the language in Revelation 13? Of course you have. Does that mean you have a stupid microchip in your forehead? No. But of course you've accepted. Of course you're worshiping. And if you're underneath, if you're in this pyramid, if you're part of the society underneath, okay, if you believe in these things, like many of the radical environmentalists, and every May 1st, these Beltane New Age weirdos go out and worship something called the Burning Man, which is an offshoot of Moloch or Baal of the Old Testament, and you worship Gaia, or the female goddess, the earth, and you believe that large chunks of the population need to be killed to save the earth. What is the difference between you and the ancient worshippers of Baal and say Artemis, or whatever the female equivalent was? Can't think of the name right now off the top of my head, but there was a female goddess that was equivalent to Artemis or Diana or Isis. Okay, Astarte, I think, is the name, if I'm not mistaken, was the Philistine but anyway, the point is you had this. I mean, they all equate to Gaia or Mother Earth. I mean, what is the difference? There is no difference. Okay, it's a different facade. Okay, and I make this point on the back of the Un-American Genocidal Complex. Okay, this human sacrifice we call abortion and population control and the environmental movement, it's nothing but recycled pagan and nature worship from the Old Testament. Okay, so if you think global warming or climate change, if you think that's about saving the environment, then why is David Rockefeller and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and these other elites behind the whole thing? George Soros and the rest of them, Maurice Strong, okay, which is basically the Canadian version of George Soros. These United Nations-centered genocidal maniacs, why are they behind all this? Do you think they give a rat's ass about the Earth's environment? You think they give a rat's ass about these useful idiots, these liberals, these American and European liberals who they use to do their dirty work? You think so? They elect somebody like Queen Jezebel or Pharaoh Barry who will do their bidding? Okay. So anyway, you have to excuse me, I can't remember how I got off onto that tangent, but anyway, so that's the tree of knowledge of good and evil, okay? And then I go down, and then we start getting into many of the numbers, okay, of these so-called conspiracy. And of course, the first one is 666, and as I've stated many times on this show, Revelation 13, it says to calculate the number of the beast, and it's the number of a man. Okay, and it's 18. Okay, so count or calculate doesn't mean, it means count. It means add up 6 plus 6 plus 6, and where do you end up? You end up at 18. Okay, the 1 and the 8, which is symbolic, which is the Rosy Cross, or the Rose Cross degree of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Now, do you think Albert Pike which was another high-level devil-worshipping Freemason of the 1800s Civil War, general for the South, and according to some sources, was a founding member of the Ku Klux Klan, Albert Pike. The Democratic Party, Ku Klux Klan, the Democratic Party that gave us Margaret Sanger and her Negro Project, like Queen Jezebel, and then they say that they're there for women's rights because they want to kill millions of black babies. But anyway, Albert Pike was mixed up in that whole founding of the modern Democratic Party, the party of eugenics, Darwinism, and Margaret Sanger's Negro Project. But anyway, he was one of the founders of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which made the 18th degree, the Rosy Cross, or the Rosicrucian, or the Robert Christian, or the male plus the female degree of Freemasonry. So these people know exactly what the hell, no pun intended, what they're doing. Okay. Everything else is just a smokescreen. So we get into that a little bit, and then here's an interesting quote from something called Rosicrucian Digest, June 1941. We predict a mythical pantheism as the religion of tomorrow. There will be no churches, but a church. The earth is the habitat of humanity. Again, getting back to the nature worshippers. Yeah, the earth is the habitat of humanity minus 6.5 billion people that we consider expendable. 6.5 billion people that will be evaporated in the impending war, World War III. Okay, so now this psychopathic drive for World War III will make a lot more sense. And we're going to get into that. I don't know if we have time to get into it tonight, but we're going to get into it maybe next show, maybe Thursday, with Albert Pike's 3 World Wars. Okay, we had World War I. We had World War II, brought to us courtesy of the Un-American Genocidal Complex. And for those of you that are counting, we've only had 2 World Wars. Okay, but anyway, getting back to the Rosicrucian Digest, since Earth is the habitat of humanity, the environmental movement is the common property of all men. I mean, talk about your Harvard, Ivy League, a-hole, utopian, communist elite, doing the bidding of their tax-exempt foundation, Federal Reserve, Un-American Genocidal Complex overlords. Okay, we have the common property of all men, minus 90% of the world's population. Physicians will be paid by the state, and their entire professionals will be absorbed by the state. Every citizen will enjoy these health benefits and guarantees. Quotas will be placed upon all professions in each of the zones of the world state. So these maniacs are trying to take over the world. Again, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't want to necessarily go off on a tangent right now, but the point is to get the feel for what this is talking about. Again, this is Rosicrucian Digest. Now, this sounds exactly, if this sounds exactly like Obamacare, that's exactly what this is. Now, what is very interesting, as an aside, these things were founded, the Anti-Ten Commandments, on March 22nd, 1980. Okay, March 22nd, 1980. Now, what was signed into law exactly 30 years to the date? Okay, 30 years plus 1 day. And there's a day of rest in there. I don't necessarily want to get but let's just say 30 years to the date. Now, the official signing date was March 23rd, but this law was in place certainly on March 22nd, 2010, what was signed into law about Obamacare. Now, remember, people were asking, what's the big rush? There's no rush to do this. What is the big rush? I mean, if anybody, remember that was the whole thing. Why are they jamming us down his throats so fast? Why that? And you say, wait a second. 30 years to the date, to the founding of these things, March 22nd, 2010, or March 23rd, the plus 1 day, which is a day of rest. And I think there's connections there, but let's just stay 30 years to the date of March 22nd, to the founding of these things. You have this very Rosicrucian, Rose plus the cross, healthcare, Obamacare debacle signed into law. Okay, and who else turned 30? In Luke chapter 4, of course, Jesus himself, 30 years of age is when he started his ministry. So if you think this is lost on these occultists, these devil-worshipping maniacs, and that's just one example. Okay, now I'm reaching off into other things. The Mystery Babylon link, or the Mystery Babylon ebook on the home page of my website. Okay, and I go through all these numbers. Okay, actually I have the link, a copy of the link right here. It's called The Numerology of Abomination, and it comes in 2 parts. Okay, and again, this could be a book by itself. And I'm just citing one example of it here. Okay, it talks about the Numerology of Abomination, parts 1 and 2. Okay, those are available again as an ebook on the home page of my site, and you can read about all the numbers. Okay, so if you're thinking, well, this guy's an idiot and that's just a coincidence, no, it ain't, because there's like 20 other things that I cited. Numbers, okay, exact numbers, the exactness of the numerology and of occultism of Pharaoh Barry, who was placed in by his Egyptian high priest overlords. It's not an accident. Okay, these people are maniacs. Okay, again, their entire being is based in numerology and occultism. Okay, again, that's the real meaning of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, it's a study of numbers. It's a study of how God designed a universe. How did God do it the first time? He did it with numbers and design. And any tree you shall eat, but don't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Remember what Satan, the serpent, said. Yea, hath God said, you shall not eat of the tree of knowledge. He said, well, God knows the day that you eat of it, your eyes shall be opened. Duh. Okay, we have the open eye of illumination, or the Illuminati. And ye shall be wise. Well, what the hell does that mean? You shall be wise. So what? Satan was into B complex vitamins or something, make you write vitamins, antioxidants, you make your brain. That's stupid. Okay, so what is he talking about? He's talking about wisdom. Okay, he's talking about man making his own way, man making his own technology, man developing heaven on earth all by himself. Okay, the problem is man with no restraint, with that kind of knowledge, becomes very dangerous. Hence the pending calamity known as World War III. Courtesy of technology that really, if you trace it back, goes back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, and now we're going to start going off into tangents. I know there's Steve Quayle and these kinds of people. Okay, talk about the Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, the fallen angels who came into the daughters of men. Okay, which are one and the same with the ancient aliens of the History Channel. I'll just leave it at that. Okay. And for people that are interested in delving into those kinds of subjects, again, stevequayle.com. And I don't know Steve Quayle from a hole in the wall, but I happen to agree with a lot of what he has to say. But I've gone off on enough tangents here. But again, it all points to this. It all goes back to the root of the whole thing, is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, and we'll try and stay on track here. And then the next number that I get into, okay, the Occult Conspiracy, is 322. Okay, and maybe this is we've talked about that number at length. Okay, and we just talked about it, in regards to the Rosicrucian Digest 1941, June 1941, and Obamacare in March 22nd, 1980, and 30 years later to the day is the signature law. This 30 years, Jesus Christ, the age he started his ministry, March 22nd, 23rd, 2010, the signing into the law of Obamacare. All right, not an accident. 322, Skull and Bones, March 22nd, 1980, foundation of the anti-Ten Commandments of the Georgia Guidestones, etc., etc. Okay, maybe we'll just end it here, and then we can get on to more numbers next week. We'll get into maybe more into this mysterious, we'll circle back to this mysterious character called Robert Christian, or Christian Rose Cross, or again, the male plus the female. Okay, so what I'm getting at is there is a universality, I'm not even sure that's a word, but the universal characteristics of the Occult Conspiracy that's starting to come into focus as we speak. And this is the seven beasts or the seven kingdoms talked about in Revelation 17. Okay, all kind of conglomerating. The 10 horns, 10 kingdoms, 10 minor kingdoms. Okay, 10 lesser nations. 10 not being a literal number, 10 being a figurative number. Okay. If you go back to the second church mentioned in Revelation, I want to say Sardis. Okay, Jesus, tells them as you can go into the seven churches, you should have tribulation 10 days, but overcome, and I shall give you a crown of life. Now, did he mean it that church would literally, a week and a half, your problems would be over? Of course not. It wasn't a literal 10 days. All right, just like in Matthew 18, and Peter asked Jesus, how many times shall we forgive those that sin against us? Till 7 times. And Jesus says, no, till 70 times, 7 times. So did Jesus just tell Peter, well, 490 times is your absolute limit that you to forgive somebody? That's ridiculous. That's stupid. All right. So the point is that's not, again, in Revelation 17, when you talk about seven heads and 7 mountains, which were symbolic of kingdoms, and 10 horns, okay, it's implying a completeness, a 7 plus a 10, okay, it's implying a completeness, it's implying a whole world, it's implying all these different cultures, okay, with their male and female goddesses, and this goes, India, okay, is another one, without a male and a female goddess, right in line with the so-called Egyptian and the Sumerian and the Roman and the Greek. They all borrowed from each other. Okay, it all comes from a common source. All these cultures had a flood. There's a flood quote legend in every culture. So everything comes from a common source. It's just different variations of the same story, which is the Genesis 3 story. Okay, I guess it's another way to say it. It's really that's the way just to wrap up. But it's all coming together as we speak, okay? So to sum up, the psychopaths will crash the economy. The Federal Reserve System is a perpetual debt machine. When you take away the countless boobs out there, the economic experts who talk about this crap, okay, and debate it like they know what they're talking about. At the end of the day, it's a debt-based system. Mathematically, it has to crash. I mean, you can assign all the graphs and nonsense and fancy Harvard economic degrees to what you want. You can apply all the douchebag Paul Krugers of the world writing for the New York Times saying we have to go into debt to get out of debt. Right for the Rockefeller-owned New York Times. Of course, they're gonna advocate going into debt because the more debt you go into, the more money Rockefeller makes. So you got the usual douchebag, like people like Paul Kruger. You got the criminals out there, the Timothy Geithner's, the Harvard, Goldman Sachs gang. Okay, Goldman Sachs is one of the owners of the Federal Reserve System. The private banking system known as the Federal Reserve. But anyway, of course they're going to advocate Keynesian economics and write for the New York Times and work for the General Electric, J.P. Morgan founded NBC. Because that's how the Federal Reserve makes money, by a nation going into debt and wars. Okay, so when the governments need to borrow money, endless money during World War I, World War II. So not only did they, cull in the population a little bit and, kind of centralize control, because, can't have those pesky world wars anymore that we started. So, we'll have the United Nations. Then from the United Nations, then we'll have universal gun control. We'll have universal laws, we'll have a world court, anti-10 commandments, and we'll have the environmental movement, okay, which justifies killing billions of the people to save Mother Earth or Gaia. So we'll spawn a bunch of Gaia-worshipping, Beltane, May 1st, communist, anarchist weirdos and send them out into the world and throughout America advocating, culling the population. And maybe we'll spike a vaccine or two with the AIDS virus and get rid of a couple 100 million along the way. We'll start some wars. We'll make some money. And when the time comes, we'll have World War III. We'll nuke 90% of the world's population. We'll hide out in our bunkers with our trillions of dollars that we stole from the Americans, the stupid Americans. Okay, and our Pentagon dark budgets will hide out in our underground chambers, and when it's all over, we'll come up, and the world under our god Lucifer will be ours. Okay. Unfortunately, these people didn't read Isaiah chapter 28 and other passages. Okay. They missed Isaiah chapter 5. They missed a lot of the Old Testament, which talks about them. Okay. Which is another thing, I'll conclude with this. Another thing that kind of cracks me up is these imbeciles out there that want to say that the Bible ripped off a lot of these other, these Epic of Gilgamesh and the Egyptians, and they just, Moses, it's the same stories. These imbeciles, okay, that with these superficial comparisons, never read the Old Testament. I guarantee you, okay, because the language that God uses in destroying these people, the 10 plagues of Egypt, etc., etc., he does everything in his power to separate himself from these legends and these so-called gods, okay? So how can you sit there and make these idiotic comparisons like you know what the hell you're talking about, and you're just talking nonsense, okay? Again, it's a lot of these Ivy League so-called experts, and they're trying to just denigrate and discredit the Bible by saying it's just a ripoff of other, the flood is, the flood story is just a ripoff of the Gilgamesh. I mean, we know the flood didn't really happen; it's just legend, even though it's reflected in every hundreds of ancient legends indicating it came from a common source. Okay. Plus the physical evidence of the flood. Okay, I don't necessarily know the Grand Canyon and all this kind of thing. The barbed canyons, they try to tell us the Grand Canyon was formed by the Colorado River, and you have barbed canyons flowing in a complete opposite, going completely uphill that nobody can explain. Okay, that's just an example. Okay, the universal deluge known as the flood is evidence all over the world for it. Okay, fossils on the top of Mount Everest. Okay, sea fossils on the top of Mount Everest. Fossils themselves, which indicate a rapid burial. Okay, fossils should never exist with evolution. Okay, tree trunks that go through so-called multiple layers. Tree trunks that should degrade over, a couple of decades, yet are found penetrating several layers of so-called sediments that settled over supposedly billions of years. But how the hell does that happen? How the hell does the tree, penetrate, how does it survive over a billion years of sedimentary fallout from billions of years of evolution? It's scientifically impossible. Again, it's evidence of a flood, of a universal flood. So there's physical evidence out there. Okay, I know it sounds like, but the point is, all this stuff ties together. Okay, so that's why the website boxofsunglasses.com. Once you come to the realization, and hopefully sooner rather than later. Okay, this is why I call these comic book Christians and these other goofballs and Fox News, and hopefully it's starting to make sense. Okay, because once you, just like in the movie John Carpenter's They Live, once you put the sunglasses on, there's no going back. Okay, and that's the parable, remember Jesus, and I think it's in Luke chapter 8, he who puts his hands to the plow can't look back. Okay, in other words, once you start cultivating, once you become a Christian, I'm not talking about these goofballs, these Chris Warren, or and Joel Osteen goofballs. Okay, I'm not, your followers, if you're listening, if you know somebody, please tell these people, quit following these losers, these con men. Okay, once you come to the realization, hopefully it's starting to penetrate, then you just it's impossible to go back. Okay, Matthew chapter 8, let the bed bury their bed. Come along and follow me. Okay, the world hates me. The servant is not above his master. If the world hates you, if the world hates me, it's going to hate you also. Okay. Anyway, we'll pick it up. The Occult Conspiracy on Thursday. boxofsunglasses.com. Good night and God bless.